"Shoot him first." The words didn't come from the man holding the gun. They came from her. For a split second, time fractured inside the room, like glass about to give way, but somehow holding its shape. 3 minutes earlier, the restaurant had been a cathedral of wealth, the kind of place where deals were whispered over aged bourbon and silence carried more weight than words. Soft amber lighting washed over marble floors, and the skyline outside stretched for miles, a reminder that power always liked a view. Ethan Cole sat at the center of it all, a white billionaire CEO whose name moved markets and whose presence alone shifted the temperature in any room. His suit was tailored within an inch of perfection, his posture controlled, his voice measured. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. People leaned in when he spoke. Across from him, investors nodded, calculating, aligning themselves with the gravity of his success. And moving quietly between them, almost unseen, was Maya Brooks, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, her steps light, her expression calm, her presence dismissed before it was even acknowledged. She refilled glasses before anyone asked, cleared plates before they were noticed, and absorbed the kind of glances that slid past her like she was part of the furniture. Ethan never looked at her directly. Not once. Not because he meant disrespect, but because in his world, people like her existed in the background, necessary but invisible. Then the door opened. Not dramatically, not with a crash, but with a sharp, unnatural precision that didn't belong in a place like this. The air shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A figure stepped inside, movements tight, uncertain, carrying something heavier than intention. No one understood it at first. Not fully. Just a ripple. A hesitation. Then the tension spread, quiet but undeniable, like a storm rolling in without thunder. A woman at the far table froze, her hand hovering over her glass. A man near the window stopped speaking, his mouth still slightly open. Ethan's eyes narrowed, scanning, assessing, trying to calculate what didn't fit. Control was his language, and suddenly, the room was speaking something else. But Maya, she had already seen it. Not the surface, not the object, the details underneath. The way the man's shoulders rose too high with each breath. The way his grip wasn't steady, not practiced. The way his eyes moved, not with purpose, but with panic. This wasn't power walking into the room. This was fear pretending to be control. And fear was unpredictable. The man spoke, voice uneven, demanding attention, demanding compliance, trying to fill the silence with something that sounded like authority but felt like desperation. Chairs shifted. Someone gasped softly. The fragile balance of the room began to tilt. Ethan remained still, every instinct telling him to take control, to speak, to fix. But this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation he could win with numbers or pressure. This was something else entirely. And in that moment, when the tension stretched to its breaking point, when every eye searched for direction and found none, Maya stepped forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one step, then another. Her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, her gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present. She didn't rush. She didn't react. She observed. And then she spoke. "Shoot him first." The sentence landed like a shockwave, not because of its words, but because of who said them. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not fear, not exactly, but something close to disbelief. The room held its breath. Because in a place where power had always belonged to money, to status, to the man at the head of the table, it had just shifted, quietly, completely, to the one person no one had been watching. No one moved, not because they understood what Maya meant, but because something in her voice made them hesitate, like a quiet authority that did not ask for permission. The man's attention snapped toward her, confusion flickering across his face as if her words had broken the script he had been clinging to. He had expected panic, expected pleading, expected chaos he could control, but not this, not a calm voice cutting through the noise with something that sounded almost deliberate. Ethan felt it too, that shift, subtle but undeniable, like the room had tilted just enough to change who held the center. He watched Maya now, really watched her for the first time, noticing the steadiness in her posture, the way her eyes did not dart or drop, the way her breathing remained, even while everyone else seemed to forget how to breathe at all. The man took a step, uncertain, his focus pulled away from the scattered guests and fixed entirely on her. And that was when it became clear, at least to her, that this moment was no longer about force, it was about attention. Maya took another step forward, slow enough not to startle, deliberate enough to guide. "You do not want him," she said, her voice softer now, measured, as if she were speaking to someone who had forgotten how to listen. "He is not the one you are angry at." The sentence hung in the air, not challenging, not accusing, but redirecting, and the man's grip shifted, just slightly, just enough to reveal the tension underneath. Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against his certainty, a realization that this woman, the one he had not even acknowledged minutes ago, was navigating something he could not. He had built his life on strategy, on control, on reading people across polished tables and structured deals, but this was different. This was raw, unstructured, unpredictable, and yet she was meeting it with something that looked almost practiced. Maya tilted her head just enough to soften the distance, her eyes never leaving his, not confronting, not yielding, just present. "You came in here for a reason," she continued, each word placed carefully, like stepping stones across unstable ground. "But this is not the place that will give you what you need." The room seemed to narrow around them, every other sound fading into a distant hum as if the world had decided to watch instead of interfere. A glass somewhere settled against a table with a faint, trembling sound, but no one reached for it. No one dared to interrupt what was unfolding. The man's shoulders dropped, barely noticeable, but enough for Maya to see the opening. She shifted her weight slightly, not closer, not farther, just enough to maintain the fragile balance she had created. Ethan could feel it now, the realization settling in deeper, heavier, that this was not luck, not instinct alone. This was understanding, a kind of awareness that did not come from boardrooms or balance sheets, but from something far less visible and far more powerful. Maya's voice lowered again, steady as ever. "Look at me," she said, not as a command, but as an invitation. And he did, not because he had to, but because something in her tone made it feel like the only option left. "You are not alone right now," she added, and for a moment, the words did not seem to belong in a place like this, surrounded by wealth and status and quiet judgment, but they landed anyway, soft and firm at the same time. The tension that had filled the room began to loosen, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough for the air to feel different, lighter, as if it could move again. Ethan exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, his mind racing to catch up with what his eyes were already telling him. That control did not always come from power, and leadership did not always announce itself. Sometimes, it stepped forward quietly, in a pressed uniform, in a voice no one had been listening to, and changed everything without raising itself above a whisper. The silence did not break. It evolved, shifting from fear into something more fragile, something that could either collapse or transform depending on what happened next, and Maya knew it, not as a theory, but as a feeling she had learned to recognize long before this night, long before this room, long before people like Ethan Cole ever entered her orbit, because calm like hers was not something you practiced in comfort. It was something you earned in moments when no one was watching and no one was coming to help. The man's breathing slowed, uneven but no longer spiraling, his eyes still locked on hers as if she had become the only fixed point in a world that had suddenly lost all structure. And for the first time since he walked in, his shoulders were not rising toward his ears, they were settling, inch by inch, like gravity had finally remembered him. Maya did not rush the moment. She did not fill the space with unnecessary words, because she understood something most people in that room did not, that silence, when held correctly, could be safer than noise. "You are tired," she said quietly, not as an accusation, not even as an observation, but as recognition, and the word landed differently than anything else had, because it did not challenge him, it saw him. A flicker crossed his face, brief but real, the kind of expression that slips through before someone can hide it, and Maya caught it, anchored to it, building from it. Ethan watched, his mind trying to map what was happening into something familiar, some framework of negotiation or strategy, but it did not fit, because this was not about leverage, it was about presence, about meeting someone exactly where they were without forcing them anywhere else. Around the room, People remained still, their earlier panic now replaced with a cautious awareness, as if they were witnessing something they did not fully understand but did not want to interrupt. A woman near the back slowly lowered herself into her chair, careful not to draw attention, her eyes never leaving Maya. A man by the window loosened his grip on the edge of the table, his knuckles no longer white, his breathing finally matching the rhythm of the room. And at the center of it all, Maya remained exactly where she needed to be, not in control of the situation in the way Ethan had always defined control, but guiding it, shaping it, allowing it to move towards something safer without forcing it. "You thought this would fix something," she continued, her voice steady, each word placed with intention, "but it will not." There was no judgment in her tone, only clarity, and that clarity seemed to cut through the confusion the man had been holding on to. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, not in defeat, but in thought, as if her words had reached a place he had not expected anyone to reach. The tension in his hands eased, subtle but visible, and Maya saw it, adjusting her own stance just enough to maintain the connection without pushing it too far. She knew this balance, knew how easily it could tip if handled incorrectly, and she respected it, treated it with the same care someone might use when holding something fragile but important. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something uncomfortable but undeniable, a realization that all the rooms he had ever controlled, all the deals he had ever closed, had never required this kind of understanding, this kind of patience, this kind of restraint. He had always believed power meant leading from the front, commanding attention, directing outcomes, but what he was seeing now challenged that completely. Maya was not commanding anything. She was not asserting dominance. She was not even raising her voice, and yet everything in the room was aligning around her. "You can still walk out of here," she said softly, offering not a command but a possibility, and the words seemed to open something, not just for the man in front of her, but for everyone listening, because it introduced a path that had not existed a moment ago. The man swallowed, his posture no longer rigid, his focus no longer scattered, and for a brief second, the room held its breath again, not in fear this time, but in anticipation. And in that fragile space, where anything could still happen, one truth became impossible to ignore. The most powerful person in the room was no longer the one with the title, or the wealth, or the influence. It was the one who knew how to remain calm when everything else was falling apart. The moment stretched, thin and delicate, like a thread pulled too far but not yet broken, and Maya could feel it in the way the air pressed against her skin, in the way every eye in the room stayed locked on a future that had not decided itself yet. The man shifted again, not forward, not back, but inward, as if something inside him had begun to fold, to reconsider, to question the path that had brought him here in the first place. His breathing steadied further, no longer sharp, no longer erratic, and the object in his hand lowered just slightly, enough for the room to notice, enough for hope to begin creeping in where fear had once taken hold. Maya did not react to it outwardly, but she marked it, adjusting her tone. With quiet precision. "You do not have to finish this," she said, her voice gentle but firm, like a hand extended without force. "You already proved something by stopping." The words were intentional, not accidental, because she knew people held on to identity even in their worst moments, and if she could give him a version of himself that did not require escalation, he might choose it. Ethan felt that sentence land, not just in the man, but in himself, because it carried something he had rarely considered in his own world, the idea that stepping back could still be seen as strength. He had spent years believing that progress meant pushing forward, that retreat was failure, that control meant never yielding, and yet here was a woman redefining all of that in real time, without authority, without status, without anything he had ever relied on. Around them, the room seemed to breathe again, subtle movements returning, shoulders lowering, hands unclenching, the quiet tension dissolving into something more human, more connected. A server near the back slowly guided a guest to sit, their movements careful, respectful of the fragile calm Maya had created. The skyline beyond the glass remained unchanged, but inside, everything was different. The man's eyes softened, not completely, not all at once, but enough to show that he was no longer trapped in the same urgency that had driven him in. "I did not come here to hurt anyone," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the forced authority it carried before, revealing something closer to truth. Maya nodded slightly, acknowledging without validating the path he had taken. "I know," she replied, and those two words carried more weight than a lecture ever could, because they offered understanding without approval, connection without surrender. She took a slow breath, matching his rhythm, guiding without leading, allowing him to feel the pace instead of forcing it upon him. "Then let this be where it ends," she added, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering. There was a pause, not empty, but full, the kind of silence that gives someone space to choose who they are going to be next. Ethan leaned forward just slightly, not to intervene, but to witness more closely, as if he understood that speaking now would break something he did not know how to repair. This was not his moment to control. This was hers. The man looked around the room for the first time since everything began, really looked, seeing not a stage, not a target, but people, faces, expressions that reflected something back to him he could not ignore. His shoulders dropped further, the tension leaving him in visible waves, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he lowered his hand completely, the last trace of chaos dissolving into the quiet certainty that the moment had passed its peak. A collective breath moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but shared, a release that connected everyone in a way the luxury around them never could. Maya did not step forward to claim anything, did not raise her voice, did not shift her posture, because she understood that real control does not need acknowledgement, it does not need applause, it simply exists in the outcome. Ethan watched her, his perception of the world rearranging itself piece by piece, realizing that the most powerful move in the room had not come from money, influence, or force, but from a calm voice that refused to let fear decide the ending. The shift was not loud, not dramatic, but it was undeniable, like a storm that had passed without tearing anything apart, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one before, softer, heavier with meaning. The man stood there for a moment longer, as if unsure what came next now that the urgency had faded, his eyes no longer sharp with tension but distant, searching for something he could not quite name. Maya did not fill the space with instructions, did not step closer or pull away. She simply held her ground, steady and present, allowing him the dignity of choosing his next move without pressure. And then, slowly, almost carefully, he took a step back. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone not watching closely, but it changed everything. The distance between him and the room widened, not just physically, but emotionally, as if he had stepped out of the moment that had consumed him. A quiet signal passed. Between people, subtle shifts of posture, soft exhales, the kind of unspoken communication that happens when danger dissolves into relief. Somewhere near the entrance, a door opened with controlled urgency, not chaotic, not forceful, just precise, and a few figures moved in with calm authority, their presence firm but not aggressive, reinforcing what Maya had already accomplished. The man did not resist, did not argue, he simply stood there, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight they had held just minutes ago, as if whatever had driven him here had lost its grip. Maya stepped back then, just one step, creating space not just for the situation to resolve, but for herself to disappear back into the role everyone had assigned her before this began. No announcement, no acknowledgement, no claim over what she had done, just a quiet return. Ethan noticed that immediately, while others began to move, to whisper, to process what had just unfolded, his attention remained fixed on her. He watched as she adjusted a chair that had been knocked slightly out of place, as she reached for a glass that had been left untouched, as she moved with the same calm precision she had shown in the middle of chaos, as if nothing about her had changed, even though everything around her had. It unsettled him, not in a negative way, but in a way that forced him to reconsider something deeper. Power, as he had always understood it, demanded recognition. It thrived on visibility, on acknowledgement, on the clear understanding of who was in charge. But what he had just witnessed did not follow those rules. Maya had taken control of a moment no one else could manage, and then she had let it go without hesitation, without attachment, without any need to be seen differently. The room slowly returned to itself, conversations restarting in low voices, chairs shifting, people checking on one another with quiet concern, But beneath it all, there was a new awareness, something that lingered in the air like a question no one had fully answered yet. Ethan stood up, not abruptly, not with his usual decisiveness, but with a measured curiosity, his eyes still following Maya as she moved toward the service station. He realized then that for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the deal he had been negotiating, not thinking about numbers or outcomes or leverage. He was thinking about her, about how someone he had not even noticed had just done something he could not have done himself, about how calm could carry more weight than authority, about how presence could shape reality more than power ever could. Maya reached the back counter and placed a glass down with care, her movements steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet exhale in her chest, the kind that comes after holding something heavy for just a little too long. She did not look around for validation, did not scan the room for reactions. She simply returned to her work, as if the moment had never belonged to her in the first place. And maybe that was what stayed with Ethan the most. Not what she did, but how she let it go. Because in a world where people fought to be seen, to be recognized, to be remembered, she had just shown him something entirely different. That sometimes the strongest people are the ones who do not need the world to know what they are capable of, because they already do. The room continued to settle, but the energy never returned to what it had been before, because something invisible had shifted in every person who had witnessed it, something that could not be undone or ignored. Conversations resumed in fragments, quieter now, more deliberate, as if everyone was still measuring their words against what they had just seen. Ethan remained standing for a moment longer, his mind refusing to move on as quickly as the room seemed to. The deal, the numbers, the strategy that had filled his thoughts just minutes ago now felt distant, almost irrelevant, like echoes from a world that no longer held the same weight. His attention stayed fixed on Maya, who was now restocking a tray with the same calm focus she had carried through the entire night. There was no trace of urgency in her movements, no sign that she had just held the room together when it was falling apart. It was not indifference, it was something else, something deeper, something that did not require recognition to exist. Ethan took a step toward her, then another, his pace slower than usual, not because he was unsure of where he was going, but because he was aware that this moment was not one he could approach the way he approached everything else in his life. Maya sensed him before she saw him, not by sound, not by movement, but by presence, the subtle shift that happens when someone enters your space with intention. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without curiosity, just acknowledgement. "Are you all right?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying more weight than he intended, because it was not just about the situation that had just passed, it was about everything he had just realized. Maya gave a small nod, her expression steady. "I am," she replied, her voice as calm as before, as if nothing had disrupted it. There was a pause, not awkward, but unfamiliar, at least for Ethan, who was used to filling silence with direction, with decisions, with control. This silence asked something different of him. It asked him to listen. "What you did," he began, then stopped, the words not forming the way they usually did, not fitting into the structure he relied on. He searched for something that would make sense of it, something that would align with the way he understood the world, but nothing felt accurate enough. Maya watched him, not impatient, not expectant, just present, giving him the space he did not even realize he needed. "You kept everyone calm," he said finally, though even as he spoke, he knew it was more than that. Maya's eyes softened slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding of what he was trying to say. "I listened," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer landed deeper than anything more complex could have. Ethan felt that settle in his chest, a quiet realization that what he had seen was not about control, not about stepping in and taking over, but about something he had rarely considered as a skill, the ability to truly listen, even when everything around you is telling you to react instead. "Most people would not have done that," he said, his voice lower now, more reflective. Maya gave a small shrug, not dismissive, just honest. "Most people are not used to being in situations where staying calm is the only option," she said, her tone matter of fact, not dramatic, not seeking sympathy. Ethan studied her for a moment, seeing now what he had missed before, not just her composure, but the experience behind it, the kind of understanding that does not come from comfort, but from having no choice but to adapt. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, the question coming out before he could filter it through his usual restraint. Maya held his gaze for a second longer, then glanced down at the tray she was adjusting, her hands steady as ever. "Life," she said simply, and that single word carried more depth than any explanation could have. Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight of that answer settling into something he could not ignore. Around them, the restaurant continued to return to its rhythm, but for him, the rhythm had changed. The way he saw the room, the people in it, the roles they played, it was all different now. He realized that he had spent years believing he understood what made someone strong, what made someone capable, but tonight had shown him a version of strength he had never measured, never valued, never even noticed. And standing in front of him was the person who had just redefined it entirely, without asking for anything in return. The conversation did not end when the words stopped. It lingered in the space between them, in the way Ethan remained still a moment longer than necessary, as if stepping away too quickly would mean losing something he had just begun to understand. Maya had already turned slightly back to her work, not dismissing him, not disengaging, simply returning to the rhythm that had always defined her place in the room, a rhythm that now felt entirely different to him. The soft clink of glass against metal echoed lightly as she adjusted the tray, each movement precise, controlled, and unhurried, as if the chaos from moments before had never existed, or perhaps as if she had already processed it long before anyone else even recognized it. Ethan watched her in silence, something unfamiliar pressing against his usual instinct to move forward, to conclude, to categorize what had just happened into something efficient and actionable. But this was not something that fit into a report or a decision tree. This was something that required him to stay present, to sit with the discomfort of not fully understanding, and that alone was new. Around them, the restaurant continued to rebuild its normalcy, but the conversations had changed, the tone softer, more aware, as if everyone was carrying a quiet memory of how quickly everything could shift. A couple near the window spoke in low voices, their expressions thoughtful rather than animated. A server checked in on a table with more care than routine required. Even the background music, once barely noticeable, now felt intentional, filling the silence with something gentle rather than masking it. Ethan finally spoke again, not with the authority he was known for, but with a kind of curiosity that had no agenda behind it. "You said you have seen worse," he said, his voice steady but reflective, as if he was testing the weight of his own words before releasing them. Maya paused just slightly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement of the shift in his tone. She did not turn fully this time, just enough to meet his eyes again, her expression unchanged but her attention fully present. "I have seen moments where people needed someone to stay calm," she replied, her answer measured, offering truth without detail, as if the specifics were not necessary for him to understand the meaning. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, realizing that her calm was not accidental, not situational, but earned, built over time in ways he could not see just by looking at her. "And no one stepped in?" he asked, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something closer to concern, something that had not been part of his usual interactions. Maya held his gaze for a second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not always," she said, her voice still even, but carrying a quiet weight that did not need to be emphasized to be understood. The simplicity of her answer settled heavily in Ethan's mind, because it revealed something he had never had to consider, the idea that for some people, calm was not a choice, it was a responsibility taken on when no one else did. He looked around the room again, at the polished surfaces, the expensive details, the people who had returned to their conversations, and for the first time, he saw the gap between the world he operated in and the reality Maya had just hinted at. It was not about money, not about success, it was about awareness, about who sees what when things fall apart. "You made a decision most people would not make," he said quietly, not as praise, but as recognition. Maya adjusted the edge of the tray, aligning it with a small, practiced motion, her focus returning briefly to the task in front of her before she answered. "I made the decision that made sense in the moment," she said, and there was no pride in her voice, no attempt to elevate what she had done, only clarity. Ethan let out a slow breath, realizing that even now, she was not framing herself as exceptional, even though what he had witnessed was anything but ordinary. It struck him then, more clearly than before, that the difference between them was not just position or experience, it was perspective, the way they defined what mattered when everything else was stripped away. Maya picked up the tray, balanced it with ease, and began to move past him, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already returned fully to the role the world expected her to play. Ethan turned slightly to watch her go, not because he needed to, but because something in him refused to let this moment pass without understanding it more deeply. And as she moved back into the flow of the restaurant, blending once again into the background she had never truly belonged to, one thought remained clear in his mind, that the most important person in the room is not always the one everyone is looking at, but the one who sees everything when no one else does. The night did not return to normal, not completely, because something unseen had taken root in the room, something that lingered in the way people now looked at one another, in the way silence carried meaning instead of discomfort, and in the way Ethan Cole could not bring himself to sit back down and pretend that everything was the same. He remained standing for a moment longer, watching the space Maya had just moved through, noticing how easily she blended back into the background, how quickly the world resumed treating her as if she were simply part of the service, as if what she had done had not shifted the entire outcome of the night. It unsettled him in a way he could not ignore. A man at his table cleared his throat gently, attempting to pull the conversation back to business, mentioning timelines and projections, but the words felt hollow, disconnected from the reality Ethan had just witnessed. He raised a hand slightly, not dismissive, just enough to pause the conversation, his mind still anchored somewhere else entirely. Across the room, Maya continued her work, checking on guests with quiet professionalism, her tone unchanged, her presence steady, offering water, adjusting settings, responding to requests with the same calm she had carried through the most critical moment of the evening. No one applauded her. No one announced what had happened. It was as if the room had silently agreed to move forward without fully acknowledging the shift that had just occurred. But Ethan could not follow that agreement. He stepped away from the table, the polished floor reflecting his movement as he crossed the space once more, not with urgency, but with purpose. This time, when he approached her, it was different. Not as someone who expected service, but as someone seeking understanding. Maya noticed him again, her awareness precise, her posture unchanged as she finished placing a glass in front of a guest before turning her attention back to him. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, the same question she had likely asked countless times, but now it carried a different weight, at least for him. Ethan paused, realizing how often he had heard those words without ever truly hearing them. "Yes," he said quietly, then stopped, adjusting his thought. "Actually, I think I already did." Maya tilted her head slightly, not confused, just acknowledging the shift in his response. There was no assumption in her expression, no expectation, just openness. Ethan took a slow breath, grounding himself in a way that felt unfamiliar. "I do not think I have ever seen someone handle a moment like that," he said, his voice steady but sincere, stripped of the usual layers of negotiation or control. Maya met his gaze, her eyes calm, reflective, as if she had heard similar words before, or perhaps as if she did not measure moments the same way others did. "Most people do not expect to be in moments like that," she replied, her tone even, her words simple but layered with meaning. Ethan nodded, understanding more now, not just the situation, but the perspective behind it. He glanced around the room again, at the people who had already begun to distance themselves from what had happened, choosing comfort over reflection, routine over awareness. It was easier that way, but for him, something had shifted too deeply to ignore. "You changed what could have happened tonight," he said, not dramatically, not loudly, just as a statement of fact. Maya did not react the way he expected. She did not accept the statement or reject it. Instead, she simply said, "I did what needed to be done," and in that moment, Ethan realized that her definition of impact was different from his. Where he measured outcomes in numbers, in scale, in visibility, she measured them in necessity, in timing, in presence. There was a pause between them again, but this one felt different, not uncertain, not searching, but grounded, as if both of them were standing in a space where something important had already been understood without needing to be fully explained. A manager approached from a distance, offering Maya a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement that carried more meaning than words, and she returned it with the same quiet professionalism she had shown all night. Ethan noticed that too, the way recognition came in small, almost invisible gestures, not announcements, not rewards, just subtle respect. He straightened slightly, not out of habit, but out of a new awareness, realizing that the way he had viewed the room, the people in it, and the roles they played had been incomplete. As Maya turned to continue her work, moving once again into the flow of the restaurant, Ethan remained where he was, no longer trying to fit what he had seen into his old understanding of power. Because for the first time, he was beginning to see that true influence does not demand attention. It earns it quietly, in moments where no one expects it, and leaves behind a change that cannot be undone. The night carried on, but it no longer belonged to business, not in the way it had when the evening first began, because something more permanent had settled beneath the surface, something that would not fade with the music or the conversation or the polished rhythm of service. Ethan eventually returned to his table, but he did not sit the same way, did not lean into the discussion with the same calculated precision, because his focus had shifted from what he could gain to what he had just witnessed. The numbers presented in front of him felt distant, the projections less urgent, as if they belonged to a version of himself that had not yet seen what real control looked like. Across the room, Maya continued her work without pause, her movements consistent, her presence quiet, yet unmistakably different now that he understood what he had overlooked. A server passed by her and whispered something under their breath, a subtle acknowledgement, and Maya responded with a small nod, nothing more, as if recognition was not something she needed to hold on to. That detail stayed with Ethan, not the event itself, but what came after, the way she carried it, the way she let it exist without defining her entirely. Time moved forward, the evening slowly finding its way back to structure, but for Ethan, something had been rearranged in a way that could not be undone. When the dinner finally came to a close, chairs were pushed back, hands were shaken, agreements were implied, but his attention returned to the same place it had been all night. Maya was clearing a table near the far side of the room, stacking plates with careful precision, her focus steady, her expression composed. Ethan walked toward her one last time, not out of impulse, but with a clarity he rarely questioned. She noticed him again, of course she did, and this time, when she turned, there was a slight pause in her movement, as if she understood that this was not just another interaction. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, the same professionalism in her tone, but now it carried something else, something quieter, something that acknowledged the shared moment between them without naming it. Ethan shook his head slowly, his gaze steady, his usual certainty replaced with something more deliberate. "No," he said, then added after a brief pause, "but I think I needed to say something before I leave." Maya held his gaze, not expecting anything, not assuming anything, simply present. Ethan took a breath, not to prepare a statement, but to make sure what he said was real. "You showed me something tonight that I did not realize I was missing," he said, his voice calm, grounded, without performance. Not just about staying calm, but about understanding people in a way that does not rely on control. The words settled between them, simple, honest, without excess. Maya listened, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflecting that she understood more than he had said. "Sometimes control is not the answer," she replied quietly. "Sometimes it is just about being there when it matters." Ethan nodded, the simplicity of her words carrying a weight he would not forget. There was no offer, no transaction, no attempt to turn the moment into something measurable or beneficial. For the first time in a long time, he let something exist without trying to shape it into value. He gave a small nod in return, a gesture that held more respect than anything he had expressed earlier that night. "Thank you," he said, not as a formality, but as a recognition of something deeper. Maya gave a slight nod back, accepting the words without expanding them, without needing to. Ethan turned then, walking toward the exit, the city lights waiting beyond the glass, the same world he had always known, but now seen through a different lens. As the door closed behind him, the room continued its quiet rhythm, and Maya returned to her work, her steps steady, her presence unchanged. But something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the way one man would move through the world from that night forward. Because he had built his life on power, on influence, on control. But that night, in a room filled with everything money could buy, the most valuable thing he witnessed was something none of it could purchase. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand attention. She did not claim the moment. She simply showed what real strength looks like. And sometimes, that is the kind of power that changes everything.